Hello and welcome to a long review of the soundtrack to Xenogears, a video game that was developed for the PlayStation 1 back in 1998. Composed by Yasunori Mitsuda. I'm going to be listening through the entire thing and talking through it, talking about what makes it work, what makes it great. But I also want to point out that this will be the beginning of an entire review and kind of retrospective, maybe, an analysis of the entire Xeno series and its music. And that really does mean listening through every single one fully. Now, if you haven't watched the channel intro yet, you might want to do that. It just takes a few minutes explaining how this is very much not scripted and not edited. It's really just going to be me talking through this music. I personally have been a fan of this series for a very long time. I didn't actually play Xenogears until the summer after I graduated high school. So it's not a game I would say was part of like my childhood, but it was one that, once I played it, it was like a complete sea change in the way I thought about fiction and just a lot of things. A lot of things changed, and it combined with a few other pieces of fiction at the time that contributed to that. But anyway, the Xeno series itself is really long, but it's been produced and developed by different companies over time, but it has maintained, the same core director and writer. And in some cases, we've got some composers, too, who have maintained their presence in this series for quite a while. Eventually, there's going to be timestamps in here for each individual track, and we'll do that for the entire Xeno series. And again, real quick, before we get into Xenogears itself, this entire series, it's this review series, really, of this Xeno series, is going to include, obviously, Xenogears, right? We've got Xenogears. And then we move on to Xenosaga Episode 1, Xenosaga 2, Xenosaga 3, right? Somewhere in there, we're going to fit the Xenosaga 1 and 2 video game that was developed for the Nintendo DS. It was never released outside of Japan, but it had its own unique soundtrack. It did not reuse music from the other games. There's some other miscellaneous stuff within Xenosaga 2 that never had a soundtrack published. And then we're going to move on to Xenoblade, of course, Xenoblade 1, Xenoblade 2, Xenoblade 3, Xenoblade X. And of course, all the DLC that came with the three games had their own soundtracks too. So it's a ton of music. All together when this is finished, it's going to be hours and hours of fun, right? Lots of talking about this series and its music. That said, this is a very interesting series for its music. And it's important to first really talk about, and again, we'll get to the actual listening to the Xenogears soundtrack eventually. That'll be time-stamped. This is the boring intro that you can absolutely skip if you know the series, you know the history, and you're not interested in this part. I do think it's important, though, to put into perspective everything. And that is, so you have this long series, and, this first game developed by Squaresoft back in 1998, directed and written by Tetsuya Takahashi. And he stayed on as the creator, the general director, and scenario writer of these games. What's interesting about him is that he mentioned in an interview once, or it was the liner notes of one of the soundtracks, can't quite remember, but he said, I've never really thought much about how music fits with fiction. Until I worked with Mr. Yasunori Mitsuda on Xenogears. And he said that, listening to his music really left a profound impact on him. And so started a relationship, a friendship with these two, and how they continued to collaborate on future projects. So that said, this series has a lot of composers and arrangers that have been attached to it over the years. And that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about too, because the quality of composition isn't necessarily consistent throughout this series, which of course the series itself is split into like these three different identities, really, right? Xenogears, Xenosaga, and Xenoblade. So that's an important element to put into perspective too, because you have many different people who have worked on this series over its inception, since its inception. So we start with Xenogears, Yasunori Mitsuda, right? He's not going to be the primary composer for the series. And we'll talk about that and how it's very interesting. It's very interesting to look at video game development and how composers are selected. And sometimes they're asked to do something and then they can't because they're doing other things at the time. So that's really interesting. Now, another thing I just want to pop up really quick, just to demonstrate, my own personal fandom for this series. We've got my shelf back there. There it is. That's basically my Xeno collection, and it obviously doesn't show what I've got digitally, but it's I've been sort of collecting. This is a series I bought every game for, played every game for, except the ones that aren't accessible. And went for soundtracks too. And so here's a little close up here. So we can kind of, that's my history with kind of the soundtrack and how it, the soundtrack series, the game series, and how it affected me. Starting, over with Xenogears. I'm ashamed to say I don't know where my PS1 copy of Xenogears went to. I wanted to replay it so much before Xenoblade 3 came out that I bought it. I bought a digital copy on PSN, but it's somewhere. That much I know. But we've got my we've got Xenogears stuff. We got a soundtrack. In fact, the soundtrack we're going to be listening to is the revival version, which differs somewhat in its sound production from the original game. I don't know. So Mitsuda himself did produce this revival disc. Squaresoft does some of these, and so he adjusted a little bit the mastering of the soundtrack itself. Now, a person could absolutely use sound software to compare the two of them side by side and get like really specific results. I don't think that's necessary. I've listened to it enough that there's not so much of a difference that it's going to affect the way I would review the actual music itself. Okay, so that's what we're going to be listening to for that. We've got the Xenosaga trilogy, up there on the top shelf, and the soundtracks that go with that, including music that's not part of the soundtrack because they just didn't publish it. That'll become very interesting when we get to Xenosaga 2. Then we get to Xenoblade, and the soundtracks really balloon in their scope, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about with that series too. But that's the little collection there, just to set the tone. Okay. Anyway, so I think I've talked enough about the intro, and there's a cat, And that means we can sort of start with the soundtrack itself and talk about it a little bit. Talk about some themes. Talk about its structure. Again, this is Xenogears for the PS1 from 1998. And it was composed and arranged and produced entirely by Yasunori Mitsuda. By the time he started this, it was only really his... it was his fourth soundtrack or so. He's a very interesting person. So when he joined Square originally, he actually did not start as a composer. He started as a sound producer and sound effect producer. He worked on Final Fantasy V, a few others. Chrono Trigger was his first composition, his first score. Shortly thereafter, he co-composed Front Mission Gun Hazard, and then went on to take a little more responsibility. He produced and directed, co-produced the soundtrack of Tobal No. 1, which is a very unique score, which I'd love to do a separate video about one day. And between all this, there was also an arranged album for Chrono Trigger, which I think there's definitely some connections between that and what he did with Tobal. And then all that led to eventually Xenogears. Xenogears, the game itself, it originally was one of a rejected concept for a Final Fantasy game, but not rejected in the sense that it was declined by the executive producers of the company, but rather they said, you know what, Mr. Takahashi, we're going to give you your own team. Make your game. Make your dream game about giant robots, which is why you see all this other stuff on my screen here. You might also take a moment to appreciate how hideously arranged I have all these windows. Those are all there for a purpose. We've got the character cast up there from the game. We've got these little action figure type things. I forget the name of the company that makes them. They're like little models. You can put them together. And those are sort of the robots that you can control in the game. And we've got a little excerpt here from the Japanese version of Perfect Works. So all of that to kind of give you a background of Xenogears itself. And those things are important. And Mitsuda's involvement is important too. Because by the time he came to this, he, again, had already had these other 3 soundtracks under his belt, along with an arranged album. So yeah, I think that's enough of the introduction, and we can kind of start with the actual soundtrack listening itself. So let's get on with it then. I've got my window open over here, and we begin with the very first track of Xenogears, which itself is it's a cinematic track, and so it accompanies a cutscene, a pre-rendered cutscene, one that was done using it looks like anime. It's what it looks like. They had produced this back in the day, and it served as the opening video of the game when you first started. And we have our first track called Dark Dawn. We start with our ominous opening here. This sets the tone. The series is that feeling of dread and ominousness and mystery. All of it does come together in such a grand way, and it's impossible to talk about Xenogears, even just the soundtrack separately, without understanding that. We have this is all very orchestral so far, right? but still synthesized. This is coming out of the PlayStation 1 hardware, you have to remember. So we're on a spaceship, right? And something goes wrong. This is the going wrong part, okay? Now, Mitsuda has here a very simple, this chord progression right here. Pay attention to that. Very simple descending chord progression. That's kind of part of the main theme itself. We'll talk about main themes and vocal themes and how those might be different or related or separate. That little flourish of a synth ostinato there. The sort of string thing that you're hearing here, Mitsuda does that a lot in his action cues. Even up through 2024. Pay attention to this. This melody here. So did you hear that in the strings there? This is an important element of the main theme. It's actually kind of the second part of what I'd call kind of the main theme. It comes up again. It's this theme that's it's very ominous, begins in the beginning of this track. This that theme itself returns in the soundtrack, and maybe even a little bit later after the soundtrack too, but we'll get to that. These are vocal samples. Mitsuda used these a lot, and has used them a lot in most of his soundtrack, vocal samples like the one you just heard. Alright. Here's our theme coming up. This is not so much a vocal sample as it is the actual instrument samples. So synthesized. But, you know, Mitsuda's doing a lot of manipulation with it to get this choral effect. Now another theme pops in here. The scene changes in the video, and then we get this totally different perspective on things. And this theme is an element of the vocal theme of the game, which we'll hear in the ending. Here's our main theme again. You hear that? We get two themes in a row, really. Right? You remember that we've heard that throughout the opening? Okay, so once again, let's just hear that secondary theme. This is part of the vocal. We'll get past that. Okay, so that and we'll again come back to that in the ending theme of that. But it's important to know that this opening theme, whether you ever realized it or not, contains these two themes. There's that a primary, very heavy, mysterious, ominous theme, right? You know, that whole sequence, and then this other one is just a snippet of our other theme that pops up in the soundtrack from time to time. So let's get on with it. Now that we have our two sort of principal themes, actually we're going to get another one in a minute, but first we listen to Stars of Tears. Here's a very interesting track. It's not played in the game, but we get a synthesized version of it for a world map theme. Here it is. We have Joanne Hogg singing the English version of this. As you can tell, this is a live performance. And just to pause for a real quick second, you know, this really is the start of Mitsuda's interest in sort of having this folk and often Irish influenced type of composition and arrangement. And this is really the first soundtrack where he really started to get into that, which became and stayed part of his central style for at least 10, 12 years or so. We don't hear it much anymore. But this was really the beginning of that interest and fascination from him. Now, wouldn't it be nice if they did play this in the overworld? Or would it become too much? At the very least, it should have been part of the ending. It's a shame that it wasn't. I think it's also important to appreciate the quality of this arrangement. It's very well done, and I really think Mitsuda took it upon himself to do the sort of live. So the soundtrack has two of these vocal themes. And this one did not appear in the game. We get a synthesized version of it, and we're going to hear that in a minute. But he really put a great deal of effort into this arrangement, and getting it to sound right and mixing it to sound really, really nice. And it is a great sounding song. It really is. Certainly there were producers at the company at the time who heard this and they were like, this is a great effort. In this very end, you know, this is obviously very much of sort of an Irish jig, which I think Mitsuda threw in there just as, because again, this was his first time really getting into this stuff. really digging into that. And that's all it was of that little jig part, by the way. We do get that style coming back in the score. But again, it's so interesting to look at this from the perspective of, wow, Mitsuda had done all these sort of Irish and folk influenced world music influenced sort of tracks over the years, but this really was his first venture into it, and he did an outstanding job with it. The quality of that, the instrumentation of this, the crispness of the acoustic guitar, the effort put into the vocal line, and how these vocal songs have Japanese versions too, which he originally, obviously, he had a singer for that, and he had a singer for the English version, which he went and he selected Joanne Hogg, whose voice is really, it's very much part of the identity of the vocal song we're going to hear at the end of this game. And she's a great performer, it's a great sounding mix with her voice in it, and the Japanese version is great too. And both of those kind of show that whether he's doing, whether we have the English version or the Japanese version, it's still a great mix, and still the melody just comes through. And the little things that you're going to find in his more world-influenced and Irish-influenced music is the way he does some of his melodies, and the way he does grace notes and appoggiaturas and things like that. It sounds really, really nice, really exciting. It's nice music. And it's invigorating. So again, it's a shame that we never actually get this track coming through the game itself. But it's very fortunate that we were able to hear it on the soundtrack that was released for it. So let's move on. This is an extremely beautiful track. It introduces a third theme of this game. Now, again, when I say theme, I'm talking a repeating melody, a melody that returns throughout the score, throughout the soundtrack. Some people might, one of the more technical terms you'd sometimes use is leitmotif, but it's a theme. It's a theme. It's a returning melody. Okay, sometimes it's for characters, sometimes just for the game itself. So these three that we've heard really are kind of like the game itself, right? And we'll kind of review those after we hear this next track. Here we've got Bond of Sea and Flame. What an interesting introduction this is too, and it's a beautiful track. This thing in the background with the harp and the pizzicato strings. We've got strings plucking and the harp. And they create this very synergistic and meditative sounding sort of ostinato background there. It's a very lovely texture, right? Kind of this... It has this mystique to it, this quality to it of a place far away that has its own history, doesn't it? If I may comment, though, because that's what this whole review series is about, it does seem like, now that I'm listening to it, again, this is the revival disc version of the soundtrack, so it came out, years later. I do find that there's less of a bass response. Like if we listen to the basses here, it's supposed to be, it's supposed to be this very sort of very... there's supposed to be a body to this, kind of underlying the whole thing, this low sound in the string basses. But it doesn't sound quite as full in the revival disc version to my ears right now, at the moment anyway. But let's continue. So we have this melody, right? So there's your introduction of another theme that reappears throughout the game. And then it continues on to its B section. Very simple descending line there. Using those appositeurs and grace notes. A very simple accompaniment of harp. And then we get to our loop point. This is such an interesting introduction track, and I think we get a lot of the mystique from it, a lot of feeling from it, because of how little visuals accompany this particular scene. So, you remember we had that opening theme, that opening with this very dramatic sort of, very mysterious, and then this action scene, right? And that was this, you're watching a video in the game. And then immediately after, you get this, and it's so different. And it's hard to describe it unless you've played the game, but we get this beautiful sort of thing, and yet the background is entirely just blank text. That's it. That's all that's playing while this is playing. We get this track coming back again, but it's 4 screens of just text, exposition, and it's not at all a problem. I don't remember it ever being a problem. Like we talk about pacing and presentation of a narrative in a video game, and this one it starts with these 4 pages of just text with this playing in the background, and it just works. It just works to set the stage and the tone. I can tell you, though, listening to this beautiful music while trying to read and comprehend text, it's hard to do. And then we get to our fade out. Again, even though there's a simple background, a background of text, if you're like me and you really hear music, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're really thinking about music actively. It's hard to read while you're listening to beautiful music or really interesting music at the same time, even though this track itself is actually not extremely complicated. I think the main element, we have this background texture, this ostinato, and with the harp and the pizzicato, with a low bass, creating this beautiful sense of mystique and wonder, and I wonder what this place is. And it's Mitsuda does this a lot with a lot of his tracks, and that'll come back, again throughout not just the Xeno series that he worked on, but other soundtracks that he has worked on. He's very good at using. It really is minimalism in a sense, and we'll talk eventually, I'm sure it'll pop up, about minimalism and how he uses it. Just to note that minimalism does not mean simple. It can. It's simplistic mechanically, but not necessarily texturally. And so, he uses it here, but, then he has this melody over it, right? Right? This line in the flute. And those two combine together to create this really just wonderful little composition that, again, introduces an important theme that comes back again and again. So what, regardless of what you want to name these themes, I sort of have my own way of sort of naming them. Like, I think that, the main Xeno theme is that sort of very dark and ominous thing that we heard, exposed in the opening theme that we listened to first in Dark Dawn, right? And then we had that live song that we just listened to that, has it's the world map theme, so that's obviously something important to the score, right? And that's just the B section of it, but there was an A section too. And now we've got this, right? And that comes back too. So be listening for that. Be present when you're hearing this stuff, so oh yeah, that's that theme we heard in Bonds of Sea and Flame, that track that plays over this opening text exposition part of the game. And then, of course, the theme we heard at the end of Dark Dawn, which may itself be the actual Xenogears main theme. This is where it's part of the vocal theme. It's part of that theme itself. We hear it in other contexts. We also hear that dark, mysterious theme, right? We've got the world map theme, and then we've got this one, Bonds of Sea and Flame. Those are going to be your primary themes that return throughout the score and sort of hold it together. And we'll talk about them when they come through. We'll point them out as they pop up. But we're going to move on to... It's called... Okay, the track here is... I should also say something about the revival disc. And I actually have not looked into this. I should probably have for myself a quick little source material so I can look at the original soundtrack. So we've had... we've had track titles floating around for a long time that do not match the English titles for the revival disc. So some people, if they're familiar with this, might be a little confused about some of the titles. So on the revival disc, they name it Village Pride. But the title that honestly most of us know this next one is called My Village is Number One. Anyway, it's the first village theme. Everything's all happy, and it's this nice little pastoral town, out in the grasslands, farmers and all that, right? Which all goes very south very soon. But we start out with this very happy little town theme. Which again, we have that folk and world music influence to it, right? We have the sort of dance style, bum bum dun 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 dun, and he's using a violin to express the melody here, a synthesized violin. And he switches over to whether it's bagpipes or Ullen pipes, and He's using that Irish influence again here, but that doesn't necessarily take over the identity of the whole song. It's very much his own way of doing this composition. All right, violin comes back. Actually, it sounds like it's combined with pipes here, doesn't it? If you think ahead to the Chrono Cross soundtrack, this will feel familiar. Again, we're coming back to choral samples, not the kind of choral voice samples that he would use that are live samples, but this, Mitsuda uses voice a lot in his compositions. This is very tightly produced right here, this part, the guitar doing its quick strums, and the syncopated baudron drum there, and, the tambourine as well. It's so, the hand clap. He does it so well, doesn't he? And the careful, again, composition of the melody here. A little appoggiatura there. Those nice open fifths at the bottom. Then you've got your acoustic bass coming in. Such a nice little theme, isn't it? I have to say, being a longtime listener of this composer, he has a lot of town themes, village themes that are just very melodically beautiful, very catchy, very memorable. This is, for as good as this little town theme is, it gets eclipsed by just overall better themes, I feel, in later RPGs, but that just goes to show the quality of his composition. This is one of the simpler ones in his repertoire, and it's really good, right? It's well produced and all of that, well composed, well arranged, and it's such a great way to think about, a great retrospective to think about the way he writes town themes, and of course every sort of subcategory of theme in this soundtrack is sort of like that. You'll have these town themes, you'll have battle themes, you'll have field themes and dungeon themes and event scenes, which sort of encompass every miscellaneous cutscene that you might find in a game, or character themes, that sort of thing. We're moving on to Wind from the Valley. Your old track title for that is Valley Where the Wind is Born. Citan's old hut. The character, that one character archetype who shows up in these Xeno games over and over again, and he knows more than he lets on. This is a nice little... this style is difficult to describe, but it's very orchestral in nature, right? This woodwind, it's basically a woodwind quintet, I suppose, quartet, and it focuses on, we've got a oboe and clarinet and the little bassoon, and I think bass clarinet too, but it's just a nice little woodwind chorus. There's the loop point. And by the way, for those who like to take the effort to perform these things live, this is one that you could literally take the notes themselves, 0 bit of arrangement, and you have a little woodwind quartet or quintet, and you could play it and it would sound great. No modifications needed. That does bring me to a point that's going to come up when we get to Xenosaga 1. And that has to do with Mitsuda's... how should I put this? So if we sort of... if we find a selection of tracks from this game, and we said, okay, these are the orchestral tracks, right? They're the ones that are meant to be played by an orchestra. Noting that there is no live orchestra in these orchestral tracks. When I say orchestral, we're talking about ones that are using orchestral instruments, but they're synthesized. At the same time, like I just said before, you give this to a woodwind ensemble, and it's going to be the perfect version of what we just heard, except with these live woodwind players. Now that said, again, Mitsuda uses orchestral music. His orchestral music in Xenogears sounds like the way he did orchestral music in Front Mission, Gun Hazard, and it sounds like how he did orchestral music in Chrono Trigger. It's not terribly sophisticated. That's because this is before he actually studies orchestration. He made, once Xenosaga comes around, he makes, that would have been around 2000, 2001. He made a conscious effort to study orchestration. But all the stuff we're hearing now is before that. And so, it works. It works for video. It's very video game music-like for composers that, they wanted to use orchestral instruments and make orchestral music. But aren't necessarily experienced orchestrators themselves. Some composers did have that skill set when they composed their works. It wasn't something that was part of Mitsuda's repertoire just yet. And so that's an important thing to think about when you're hearing this select. I don't know. I haven't counted how many tracks are like orchestral, but certainly, a lot of the battle music, a lot of the action cues we hear, and even smaller ensembles like this are that. Which is to contrast with the more world music sounding ones. And even ones that are more jazz or electronic in nature. But it would be interesting then for people, I think, to listen to how his orchestral style evolved from here, this, we'll just say pre-Xenosaga to post-Xenosaga, because that's the point at which he really put an effort into studying orchestration itself, classical music, and really how the orchestra is employed and how to correctly compose for it as well. You learn about orchestration. That's a separate skill than arranging, and it's a separate skill than composing, and it's a separate skill than music theory or whatever, music analysis. But it absolutely would change a composer's approach to composition. The truth really is about orchestral music generally is that those who know orchestration and are also composers, they're going to be really good at composing orchestral music. It seems really simple and basic, but the difference between those who know the skill and those who don't, it shows. It really shows, or it sounds, in their music. But we'll continue on we'll continue on. By the way, this is just real. This is the kind of talking I'm going to do. Lots of interrupting of your music, but that's what this, again, that's what this soul thing is really for. Not necessarily just to sit and listen, but to really kind of dig into it. Okay, now we move on to another very important track. Important because it brings back one of those themes that we've already heard. So here we've got Faraway Promise. As you can tell, this is a music box arrangement, and that does have to do with the scene you hear this in. It's a very special moment. Those who know the game and the story they'll feel something when listening to this one. Now this part right here, this is what we heard at the end of Dark Dawn. It's the B section of the vocal theme, which we'll hear at the end of the game, and of course this first part, right? That's the A part. Now we have this other section. And in Dark Dawn, we just hear a little bit. This is the first exposition of the full theme itself. And it's honestly really brilliant how this is used. Again, this will come back, but using it in this music box version, it's very clever. It again, this is the first full exposition of this very critical theme, this critical melody to the game. I'm thinking, I always hear the vocal theme too, so it's like I want to go to the next part in that melody when we finally get to that. But that theme is so special to the story. This is one of those things that's great about this soundtrack, and a lot of them that Mitsuda does, and really the best soundtracks have this really special melody writing that connects to the game in a way that's unique to the game itself. That's when you know that's definitely an element of a great video game soundtrack. And great film soundtracks too, really, but video games are special because you've got these cutscenes that are, especially back then and this time, they were not voiced. You didn't hear character voices. You read the text. You imagined their voices. And then you'll have scenes that have melodies that are like, one of the main central themes of the game. And again, when I say theme, throughout these series that I do, when I say theme, I don't mean the literary theme, I mean the musical theme. But you hear them and they mean something in context. They really do. Of course, the first time you hear this in the game, if you never played the game before, you'll hear this and it's this beautiful little melody. And you're like, oh, it's really pretty. What does it mean? But it sticks with you, and it's a great scene because the main character hears this and he's like, and I won't say more about that, but he reacts to it in a way that's very critical to the actual plot line itself. What a great little music box track. So Mitsuda does these music box tracks for other games too. And they're always very, it's kind of sentimental, but very pretty, very lullaby-like, but always very well composed. All right, we move on to... Yeah, so this is a weird insert here. Okay. Stop. Just one real quick thing about this. This is not on the original soundtrack. This is in the game, but it was not published on the first printing of the 1998 soundtrack. So just, here it is. It's a real quick, you call it in film they often call it like a stinger. It's just a real quick musical accompaniment to something happening. It's not a full piece of music. It's just this real quick like music effect almost. That's all it is. It's just this real build up, this string build up, this in a chord. Very simplistic. Has the effect, the intended effect though. All that pastoral, idyllic, peaceful feeling that we just had. Yeah, that's about to change. Let's listen to Steel Giants. So again, orchestral, right? Pretty simplistic use of the orchestra in this case, but it has its intended effect, right? One thing I'd like to pause just to say quickly is that Mitsuda's battle themes are sort of interesting, especially when he does orchestral ones like this. You remember these themes we had before in this real clear melody and memorable melody to kind of cling to? These battle themes don't always have that. A lot of times we're just listening to sort of just kind of these big orchestral chords. There's if we listen to the top note, maybe we call that our melody. We have this... And that, it's just this, it's very simple. It's scalar, there's not much to it. And then we have these kind of punctuating chords, right? So feeling more of really just a little, this little kind of back and forth figure, right? Rather than a sort of a melody. And then we have those long notes again. Not much of a melody here, but this is a battle theme. It's a battle theme you hear when you're fighting in these giant robots here against other giant robots and other monsters. And so that's kind of the sort of theme, setting that it accompanies. This has a really cool ending to it, though. That lovely little outro there, right? But yeah, this is your mecha battle theme. Again, we're not doing much with melody here. We want kind of bombast, but quite controlled, obviously. This is a very common thing with Mitsuda's music too, these orchestral battle cues, using strings for melody and then brass to like punctuate it. Dun 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 ba-da-da ba-da-da, you know. He does that a lot. These are just, you know, big chords, right? Dun 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 bun bun. And our nice little outro. And that's all there is to it. This accompanies an amazing scene in the game, though. But the story really, like, takes a sudden turn. Which leads us to Forest of the Black Moon. This is such a beautiful composition. And it's so it's like it has multiple chapters within the track itself. You definitely call this orchestral. Real simple piano stuff. He's accelerating. Very ominous, but this is to create a texture. And then we bring this section in, which really sounds like something from Chrono Trigger, doesn't it? You know, these sort of strings and then the piano. Doing the ostinato, right? Harp comes in. And then we go on to yet another section. Almost like the main body of the track, really, is here. Imagine that first part is like you're entering this forest. Sort of very dark forest, you know, at night. But now you're walking around it. You're exploring it, but you're being careful. But there's elements of mystery to it, too. Here we get these piano chords, you know, these parallel chords that Mitsuda loves to do. And then this melody comes in with the oboe. And then the final section. We go back to using instruments to create a texture. Right? We have these ascending lines that are creating chords that are kind of ascending. Right? And he's using a really clever technique there, using, you know, he's got percussive keyboard over here on one side, and he's got a harp over here, and they're sort of helping each other build up these ascending dyads, and it sounds really nice the way he's able to kind of put these together. Now the track repeats, but it doesn't loop back to the beginning. You know, it goes straight to the part we called the beginning of exploration. Now, I liked this track so much, I actually did a piano arrangement of it, a synthesized piano arrangement of it. I don't know why, because it has these different, like, chapters to it, right? There's that very mood-setting intro, right, this part. Just all very, you know, tension, right? The orchestra. And then finally the part that loops, right? The main body of the piece. It was really, you know, it was really difficult to do it, but then the piano piece really ended up sounding the kind of like, you know, these different parts of, they could have been separate compositions, you know, but this track works. He's able to just weave this one track with that Very different intro, and then this main body of the track, and it just sounds so great. It sets up the mood so well in this place. I believe we were here, right? Dun, 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 dun. Now, the stuff with the piano, these parallel chords, he does that a lot. We hear it all the time. We heard it in Chrono Trigger. We heard it in Front Mission Gun Hazard, and we'll hear it for the rest of his career. He uses these sorts of chords to create sometimes tension, sometimes he uses them for like infiltration scenes, and sometimes for dungeon music and so on. This part is so excellently arranged. The syncopated triangle and tambourine plus that ascending figure. It's very well done. Even the harmonies, the chords themselves are not that complicated at all. It's all about that texture, and he does that extremely well, even on this old PS1 hardware. Great track. And the first little field theme that we hear in the game. Alright, and that's going to lead us to another critical theme, which most of us know as a piece called Where the Egg of Dreams Hatches. Sorry, Shattering Egg of Dreams. There's so many different... A little side note. Like, the side note was not that cat meowing just now. It was just to say that you're going to have so many different translations of... Because originally these were titled, these tracks were titled in Japanese. So you'll have these slightly differing translations. So whatever you want to call it, Where the Dream Egg Hatches, I think is one that I mostly know it by. But what an important theme. So beautiful. Sort of an Irish-style harp playing, right? I'm going to go ahead and say this is like theme number 5 that's critical to this game. So we really get all of those within the first, 7 tracks in? We only get this one like twice though. This is really a small ensemble playing this. It would sound so good if you just gave this as is. You have your harpist playing this part. It could be an Irish harp too, and I think that would sound just right for this type of arrangement. We've got a background of a string ensemble, playing very gently, but it's this critical melody in the piano. With the violas and violins, The simple accompaniment of the strings plucking, right? Bum, 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 bum. Such a beautiful theme. And then we have our fade out. Definitely one of my favorites. One of those themes that I just can't help but hum along to. You know, I just can't help it. I want to. And again, that's theme number 5. Important themes, right? We have that, you know, we should really start making a list. You know, I have the screen so cluttered with all these windows. I should really have like a little spreadsheet somewhere saying like, okay, theme number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you know, to help people make sense of it. But again, that's something that when I listen to the score, I sort of know these themes really quite well, so I can hear them when they come out. But anyway, so we'll end part 1 of that video right here. We had a long introduction to Xeno generally as a series. Then we talked, we had an intro section about the Xenogears game itself, the first one, and its music and its composer a little bit. And we got through the first 10 tracks and we talked about its main themes. And that's just scratching the surface. You know, we're altogether, this revival soundtrack has 49 tracks to it. A handful of which are exclusive to this version. They were never in the game, and they were newly arranged for this release. So there's a lot more to listen to the next time we come back. I think, you know, as a listener, if this is something that you're sort of listening through, kind of hoping to develop your sense of the score and your understanding of it, think about how those themes that we talked about are going to develop. And when they come back, play them a little bit, play them on a piano, or just sort of hum along to those themes and get them into your head, because that'll help you identify them when they return in later tracks. That's very fun to do. It's fun to pick it out and be like, oh yeah, Mitsuda did this here. Oh, he brought that theme back here. Oh, that's such a clever way to do that. You know, that's how we think about, I think. That's how I think about like really good soundtracks. Good composers will do that sort of thing. They'll have in mind their themes that they composed, and they'll bring them back, sometimes in very subtle ways. We kind of heard it already. We heard it with the ending of Dark Dawn, the opening thing that. And that's just a little bit of that very important vocal theme that we hear in that music box theme we listened to, Faraway Promise. And those are going to come back. That's what we enjoy about these themes. And it's going to be really interesting to compare the thematic structure of this game. Again, I'm not talking literary structure. We're talking musical thematic structure, and how that will contrast with later games in the series. Because the contrast it's pretty extreme, you're going to find. But that's what makes this journey worth it. Listening through this whole thing, this hours worth of music. The analysis of it is very, it's just fun. It's fun to do. It's fun to think about and talk about and learn from, especially if you yourself are a musician or composer. This is a great place to learn a lot from this series and how the music changes from game to game. So yeah, we'll end part 1 there. We'll come back next time with part 2, which will be kind of the you know, I almost should have ended with this last one. No, we're not going to. It's the in theme when you go to sleep. What a great ending piece that would be. See, this is what I mean by this series being unscripted. I could have thought about that beforehand and said, this would have been a great place to stop. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Thank you for joining me for this one. See you on the next.